Welcome to the channel. I'm so glad you're here with us today. We've got a special story lined up for you, and I can't wait to share it. As you're watching, let me know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below and let's see how far our community reaches. If you enjoy the story, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on tomorrow's exciting episode. We've got plenty more to come, and I'd love for you to be part of this journey. Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. I'm eager to hear from you. A Life Saved in the Cold, the Royal Guard's Unthinkable Act. It was war. An ordinary winter morning at Buckingham Palace. But everything quickly changed when the sky began to darken. What had started as a gentle dusting of snow soon transformed into something much more intense. The winds picked up, and the snow swirled in a chaotic dance, turning the peaceful day into a tempest. The snowflakes fell faster and heavier, coating the streets and buildings in an unseasonal blizzard that sent tourists running for warmth. The once glowing ivory walls of the palace, which usually shimmered in the soft daylight, were now obscured by the white, swirling storm. The golden gates that normally gleamed in the sun were dusted with snow, looking more like they had been covered in powdered sugar. The wind howled through the area, whipping the snow into a frenzy, making it nearly impossible for anyone to stand still for long. Despite the blizzard, the Royal Guard stood unwavering in their positions, as if untouched by the storm. Their red, scarlet tunics were crisply buttoned, and their tall black bearskin hats seemed to defy gravity, as the snow relentlessly pelted them. It was a striking contrast to the chaos that surrounded them. Among the retreating tourists and the growing storm, one guard in particular stood out, Edward Collins. He had been stationed here for 3 winters, each one colder and more biting than the last. At 27 years old, he had grown up in the harsh winds of the northern moors of England, where winters were brutal, and the cold was something you learned to fight against. From a young age, Edward had learned an important lesson. When the storm comes, you stand your ground. His breath formed little clouds in the air as he stood, his rifle held snugly by his side, a steady and immovable figure in the face of nature's wrath. To the huddled crowd behind the barriers, his presence was almost otherworldly. Their faces were red from the cold, their teeth chattering uncontrollably, their gloves dusted with white. Yet Edward remained perfectly still, like a living statue. His face was stoic, his posture rigid, and his eyes trained on the distance, betraying no emotion, no discomfort. In the midst of the chaos, he was a symbol of unwavering strength and discipline. But in the midst of the retreating crowd, there was one woman who caught Edward's attention. She was wearing a bright crimson puffer coat, and she had wandered a little too close to the palace, seemingly entranced by the intricate frost-covered windows. The wind whipped around her, and her scarf was torn away by a gust. She rubbed her arms for warmth, but her gloves had disappeared somewhere in her bag. As she stepped backward, she slipped on the icy cobblestones, landing hard on her hip with a muffled gasp. A sudden hush fell over the courtyard. The storm's fury seemed to quiet for just a moment. All eyes darted to her, and then to Edward, who remained as motionless as ever. It wasn't protocol for the guards to move. They didn't react. They didn't speak. They were statues, meant to remain unmoving, no matter the circumstances. But something stirred inside Edward's chest as he watched her struggle to rise, her legs shaking, tears freezing on her cheeks. He could see the woman's name tag half buried in the snow. Heroko. She must be a tourist from Japan, he thought, and in that moment he saw something beyond the protocol, something that felt more human. Edward's instincts kicked in. It wasn't alarm that he felt, but compassion. Without thinking, he took a careful step forward once, deliberately, his rifle still across his chest. He crouched down beside her, not as a guard, but as someone who saw another person in need. The crowd gasped. Cameras went up, but Edward didn't look at them. He only looked at Heroko. "Miss," he said softly, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Can you stand?" Heroko's teeth chattered so loudly they sounded like hail on a tin roof. "I slipped," she stammered. "My coat, it's not enough." She tried to stand, but the cold had already numbed her legs. Edward didn't hesitate. He flattened his back against the wind, reached into his pouch for the spare woolen blanket he carried, and gently wrapped it around her shoulders. Despite the freezing winds, his actions were calm and deliberate. "Hold on to me," he said, offering his arm with surprising strength. With a small gasp of relief, Heroko gripped his arm and he helped her to her feet. The crowd exhaled collectively, a wave of relief washing over them as they watched the guard assist the woman in the midst of the storm. As Edward helped Heroko to her feet, the wind howled louder, the storm's fury still relentless. The crowd, their faces frozen from the cold, watched in stunned silence as the royal guard knelt before the fallen tourist. Edward's hands, though steady and firm, were trembling slightly from the freezing air. Yet he didn't care. In that moment, his focus was entirely on Heroko, the woman who had slipped and now stood unsteady in the howling snow, her breath visible in soft clouds in front of her. He glanced down at the woolen blanket wrapped around her shoulders. It was standard issue, meant for emergencies, and now it served a far greater purpose than anything it was ever intended for. Heroko's face, flushed from the cold, was still wet with tears, and Edward could see the vulnerability in her wide, startled eyes. She was a foreigner, lost in the swirling chaos of the blizzard, her grip weak on the blanket she clutched around herself. The sight made something tighten in his chest, a deep, unshakable feeling of compassion. The tourists around them were motionless, some pulling out their phones to capture the rare moment. But Edward was oblivious to the cameras, the growing crowd, the silent applause building in the distance. His focus was entirely on Heroko. "Are you all right?" he asked again, his voice low and gentle but with a quiet authority. His words, though soft, carried weight. A calm reassurance in the midst of a storm that had sent even the most confident tourists running for cover. The snow whipped around them, and Heroko's shivering increased, but she shook her head, unable to speak for a moment. I can't feel my legs," she managed to say, her voice choked weak. Her hands, though muffled by her mittens, trembled as she tried to steady herself. Edward's heart went out to her, and despite everything, despite the need to remain stoic, despite the protocol he was trained to follow, he couldn't simply walk away. Without a second thought, he took off his own gloves, still gripping his rifle, and offered her his arm. Heroko hesitated for a moment, then with a soft sob, gripped his arm tightly. The crowd seemed to hold its breath as Edward helped her move slowly toward the sheltered entrance of Buckingham Palace. Technically, the palace's thresholds were off-limits to tourists, but Edward didn't hesitate. There were no rules in this moment that mattered to him. Only one thing did: her safety. His steps were measured, firm, as he guided her to safety, the blanket still draped over her shoulders. She leaned into him, her body shivering uncontrollably, and Edward silently wished he could do more. Her weak grip on him tightened slightly, a sign of trust that seemed to speak volumes. "Better?" he asked quietly, his words barely audible. Above the wind, Heroko nodded, though her lips were still trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft, barely a breath in the icy air. Her eyes met his for a brief second, and in that moment, something passed between them, a fleeting but deep understanding. Behind them, the security officer approached. His face was stern, his brows furrowed in confusion at the sight of a royal guard helping a tourist. But when he saw Edward still holding Heroko steady, the officer's stern look melted into something more akin to approval. With a small nod, he raised a hand, signaling that no intervention was needed. The guard had it under control. Minutes passed as the storm gradually began to lose its strength. The wind started to subside, and the snow, though still falling, seemed less fierce. The crowd, once filled with chaos and confusion, now seemed more composed. Then, from the crowd, a woman, Heroko's mother, rushed forward. She had been searching frantically for her daughter, her face pale with worry, her eyes scanning the scene. When she spotted Heroko, tears instantly began to track down her cheeks, her hands reaching out. She enveloped her daughter in a warm embrace, murmuring comfort and relief. "She's all right," Edward called gently, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Just needed a moment." The crowd exhaled as one, their collective tension broken by the reassurance. Applause slowly began, hesitant at first, but growing in volume. A few brave souls cheered, shouting, "Well done, guard! You saved her!" Phones hovered, capturing every moment. Every detail of the red coat, the blanket, the tender way Edward had helped Heroko stand. The image of a royal guard in the blizzard, offering warmth in the cold, was too striking not to share. By the evening, footage of the rescue had gone viral. Social media was ablaze with praise. Comments flooded in, with people calling Edward's actions heroic, even groundbreaking. "Royal Guard breaks protocol for compassion," one comment read. "In the coldest storm, kindness finds a way," said another. People shared stories of their own moments of warmth during the winter, many inspired by Edward's choice to show humanity over duty. Edward didn't watch the clips. He didn't care for the clicks or the attention. The next morning, despite the lingering frost, he returned to his post. His tunic was immaculate, his stance tall and proud. But there was something different about him now. When he stood at attention, his shoulders felt just a little lighter, as if the world's gratitude had settled there. And somewhere in Tokyo, Heroko was telling her story, sharing the memory of a man in scarlet who knelt in the snow, not to punish, not to parade, but to protect. Edward's eyes never left Heroko as he helped her to her feet. Her legs were weak, barely able to hold her up. The chill from the ground had sunk deep into her bones, and even with the woolen blanket wrapped tightly around her, she shivered uncontrollably. Her breath came in quick, frozen bursts, and every step she took seemed more difficult than the last. But she had a quiet determination, and with Edward's steady arm guiding her, she slowly regained her balance. The crowd around them, who had been frozen in place just moments before, now seemed to come alive. Whispers spread like wildfire. People who had been huddling together to shield themselves from the storm began to inch closer, their eyes wide in disbelief. The silent figure of Edward, a statue in scarlet, had shifted into something far more human, compassionate, gentle, and utterly unexpected. "Hold on to me," Edward said again, his voice a steady whisper in the howling wind. He placed his arm around her waist, pulling her close enough to offer support, but not enough to make her feel weak. His grip was firm, reassuring. He wasn't just a royal guard now, he was a protector, someone who had transcended the rigid protocol of his post. As they moved slowly, carefully towards the sheltered side of the palace, Heroko stumbled, her legs refusing to cooperate. Her hand gripped the sleeve of his tunic with desperate strength. She was clinging to him, as if her life depended on it, and in a way, it did. The storm was relentless, but it was the warmth of his presence that kept her anchored to the present. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but words were too difficult to form in the cold. Instead, she just pressed her forehead against his arm, seeking solace in his steadiness. They reached the cover of an ornate column, standing just outside the formal tourist boundaries of the palace. The wind howled louder, the snow swirling, in a frenzied dance around them, but here, under the stone, there was a small shelter. Heroko felt the weight of the storm lift just slightly, and she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Edward, his back turned slightly, to shield her from the worst of the storm, draped the blanket more securely over her lap. "Better?" he asked, his voice still calm, still carrying the quiet authority he had learned to wield over the years. Heroko nodded weakly, blinking up at him. Her teeth chattered so violently it sounded like hail against a tin roof, but she managed a shaky smile. Her eyes welled with tears, not from the cold but from the overwhelming kindness she had just witnessed. She had been alone in a foreign country, caught in a storm both literal and emotional, and yet here was a man in scarlet who had stopped everything to help her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Edward nodded, his expression unchanged, but there was a softness in his eyes that wasn't typically there. "You're safe now," he replied simply. Behind them, a palace security officer approached, his face stern and confused as he watched the scene unfold. Edward's position, his protocol, had been violated. A royal guard breaking his station to help a tourist. The officer's hand twitched, but when he saw the scene, Edward kneeling beside her, ensuring she was covered, offering comfort, the stern expression melted into understanding. With a small nod, he raised his hand, signaling for no further intervention. Edward had it under control. The storm raged on for a few more minutes before it finally began to ease. The wind died down, and the snow lessened to a steady fall. Heroko's mother, frantic and terrified, appeared through the crowd. Her face, streaked with tears, searched desperately for her daughter. When she saw Heroko, her face lit up with a mix of relief and disbelief. She rushed forward, her arms enveloping her daughter in a tight embrace, whispering words of comfort as she cried. Edward, ever the professional, remained a few steps back, watching as the two were reunited. He felt a strange warmth in his chest, despite the freezing wind. There was something profoundly human in the way the moment unfolded. No guards, no protocol, just a simple act of kindness. As the crowd exhaled in unison, a wave of relief swept through them. Some clapped, some cheered, but the air was thick with gratitude. Edward didn't react to the applause. His focus remained on Heroko and her mother, ensuring they were both safe. He didn't care about the phones hovering, capturing every moment. He didn't need the recognition. But he couldn't ignore the quiet shift in the air, the feeling that he had done something truly right, something that transcended duty. The next morning, after the storm had passed, Edward returned to his post. His tunic was immaculate, his stance as solid as ever. But there was something different in the way he stood. His shoulders were a bit lighter, as if the world's gratitude had settled there. He didn't know it yet, but his simple act of compassion had already become a legend. And somewhere far away in Japan, Heroko would tell the story of the guard in scarlet who, in the midst of a storm, knelt to protect a stranger, proving that even the hardest of hearts can soften in a moment of kindness. The snowstorm began to lose its intensity as the minutes ticked by. The wind, though still present, had eased its cruel assault, and the swirling snow settled into a gentler fall. Heroko, still sitting under the protection of the ornate column, began to feel the warmth of the blanket seep into her chilled body. The worst of the storm had passed, but the emotional weight of what had just happened still lingered in the air. Heroko's teeth chattered less now, and her breath steadied, though she still felt the lingering shock of her fall, of her helplessness, the storm. She pressed a mitten-clad hand to her face, wiping away the tears that had frozen on her cheeks. It wasn't just the cold anymore. It was the overwhelming kindness she'd been shown, something so unexpected in the midst of chaos. Behind her, the crowd had started to thin out, the majority of tourists huddling together to escape the storm, but a few still lingered, casting glances at the royal guard. Phones were raised, capturing the scene. Edward noticed the flickers of camera lights, but he didn't care about the photos, the applause, or the attention. What mattered to him was that Heroko was safe, that she had found a brief moment of peace amidst the storm. As Heroko's mother appeared through the crowd, her frantic gaze searching desperately for her daughter, Edward stood to the side, his gaze never leaving the pair. When Heroko's mother spotted her, a wave of relief flooded her face. She rushed forward, her arms wrapping tightly around her daughter, pulling her close and murmuring comforting words. "She's all right," Edward called gently, his voice breaking through the tension in the air. Just needed a moment. The onlookers, many of whom had been watching the scene unfold, exhaled in unison. It was a collective sigh of relief, as if the storm had finally lifted not just from the skies, but from their own shoulders. A few brave souls began clapping, a few even shouting out words of praise. "Well done, guard," someone called. "You saved her." Phones were now capturing every moment, the snow falling in soft drifts, the red of Edward's tunic standing out against the whiteness of the ground. His kneeling figure, the blanket wrapped around Heroko, was a stark contrast to the harshness of the storm. To the tourists, It was an image of calmness in the face of chaos, a symbol of what it meant to be more than just a guard, more than just a soldier. Edward didn't react to the applause. His focus was entirely on Heroko and her mother, ensuring that they were both all right. His duty had been to protect, to help, and he had done so without a second thought. He didn't care for recognition or praise. It was enough for him to know that in this moment, he had made a difference. The snow continued to fall, but the worst of it had passed. After a few minutes, the palace security officer approached, his stern face now softened with understanding. He had seen Edward's actions, witnessed the way the guard had broken protocol to help the tourist, and yet there was no anger in his eyes. Instead, he raised his hand in a silent gesture, signaling that no intervention was necessary. Edward had it under control. As the minutes passed, Heroko's body relaxed, the tension slowly leaving her. She wasn't just warmed by the blanket, but by the unexpected kindness that had been shown to her. She couldn't stop thinking about the man in scarlet, the one who had knelt in the snow, not to punish, not to criticize, but to protect. She looked at him with gratitude, her eyes filled with emotion, and she whispered softly, "Thank you." Edward gave a small nod in response, his formal salute softened by the circumstances. For a brief moment, the rigidity of his training seemed to slip away, replaced by something more human, more real. As Heroko's mother wrapped her arms around her daughter, there was a collective sigh of relief from the crowd. Edward helped the two of them to the side, out of the worst of the storm. The applause continued, but for him, it was just background noise. The true reward was knowing that he had done something meaningful, something that went beyond duty. Over the next few minutes, the storm finally began to ease. Heroko, now calmer, looked up at Edward, her gratitude still evident in her wide, tear-filled eyes. Behind her, the security officer approached, nodding to Edward. The crowd slowly began to dissipate, but the moment, the kindness that had transpired, lingered in the air long after the snowstorm had passed. By the time Edward returned to his post, the storm had almost completely abated. The streets of Buckingham Palace were quiet once again, and the tourists had all retreated. Edward, however, stood a little taller that day, feeling the weight of the gratitude settle on his shoulders. It wasn't the storm that had made him feel lighter. It was the knowledge that, in a moment of chaos, he had done the right thing. And somewhere in Tokyo, Heroko would share her story, telling her family and friends about the royal guard who had bent the rules, not to show his authority, but to show compassion. She spoke of how his breath had mingled with hers, his red tunic standing out against the white storm, a beacon of warmth and humanity in a world that often felt too cold. As the minutes passed, the wind slowly began to calm, and the snow settled into a quieter, lighter fall. Heroko, now wrapped securely in the woolen blanket, let out a sigh of relief. The worst of the storm had passed, but she could still feel the biting cold deep in her bones. Her heart, however, felt warm. The kindness she had just received was overwhelming, and the sight of Edward standing tall and stoic, his rifle at his side, made her realize something powerful, that in the most unexpected of places, compassion could still shine through. The crowd had started to thin, some still lingering, whispering amongst themselves, but most were retreating to find shelter from the now gentler storm. Heroko's mother, frantic with worry, emerged from the crowd. Her face, wet with tears from the storm, immediately softened when she spotted her daughter, safe and steady under Edward's protection. She rushed forward, arms outstretched, and enveloped Heroko in a tight embrace. Edward, watching the reunion, felt a wave of satisfaction wash over him. It was a small gesture, perhaps, but in the chaos of the storm, he had made a difference. Heroko was safe. That was all that mattered. As her mother held her close, murmuring soft words of comfort, Edward didn't speak. He just stood by, letting the moment unfold. The crowd, which had been tense and worried just moments before, now let out a collective breath. Some people applauded, some cheered, their voices mingling with the fading winds. "Well done, guard," a voice called out from the crowd. "You saved her." More claps followed, and soon the phones were out, capturing every moment of the rescue. The image of Edward kneeling beside Heroko, his red tunic standing out starkly against the white blanket of snow. The soft blanket draped over her lap, and the gentle way Edward had leaned in to help her, were forever captured in the eyes of the onlookers. Edward didn't flinch. He didn't look at the cameras, the people, or the phones that hovered around him. He didn't care about the praise, the attention. What mattered to him was that Heroko was no longer in danger, that in a moment of chaos he had chosen to help her. As the minutes passed and the storm began to lose its force, the royal guard maintained his position. Heroko, wrapped in warmth, felt the sting of the cold on her face recede. The storm had passed, and the feeling of gratitude inside her was overwhelming. She turned her eyes to Edward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Edward nodded, his gaze never wavering from hers. "You're safe now," he replied quietly, though there was a softness in his voice that she hadn't expected. Despite the stiff, formal nature of his position, Edward had managed to show a humanity that transcended protocol, and it wasn't lost on Heroko. At that moment, a palace security officer approached. His expression, stern and professional, softened when he saw the situation. He had been preparing to intervene, but as he watched Edward help Heroko, he understood. There was no need for interference. Edward had it under control. The storm's fury finally subsided, and the snowfall slowed to a gentle drift. Heroko's mother, who had been searching frantically for her daughter, spotted her and rushed to her side. Tears of relief mixed with the snow on her cheeks, and she embraced Heroko tightly. "She's all right," Edward called gently, reassuring the mother. "Just needed a moment." The crowd's collective relief was palpable. The applause swelled, and even a few cheers broke through the cold air. Phones were held high, capturing every detail of the moment. The red of Edward's tunic against the snow, the soft, protective way he had helped Heroko. The footage quickly spread across social media, with people praising the royal guard for breaking protocol to show compassion. Headlines across the internet spoke of how kindness could break through the hardest of protocols, how one man's compassion saved a life. Edward didn't watch the videos or read the comments. He didn't care for the attention. The next morning, despite the lingering frost on the palace grounds, he returned to his post. His tunic was as immaculate as ever, and his stance was as tall as it had always been. But there was something different about him. As he stood at attention, his shoulders felt lighter. The world's gratitude seemed to settle there, a weight that was both heavy and comforting. He didn't need to hear the praise. The knowledge that he had done something right was enough. Somewhere in Tokyo, Heroko told her story over tea. As she shared the details of the day, the guard in scarlet, the warmth he had offered in the midst of the storm, her voice carried the memory of that moment, that act of humanity. Her family listened, wide-eyed and amazed, and her niece traced the design on her teacup, imagining the red tunic, the brass buttons, and the snowflakes falling softly around Edward as he knelt to protect a stranger. Back in London, the story of Edward's compassion spread through the barracks. Guardsmen gathered in the mess hall, swapping stories over bitter tea. Though the protocol for discussing off-duty compassion was tight, Edward's act had slipped into legend. A young recruit passed around a photo of the scene, the red of Edward's tunic, the blanket draped over Heroko, and the gentle, life-saving gesture. "Remember why we stand," a veteran said quietly, his voice filled with certainty. "And when it's right, why we kneel." Months later, as spring thawed the last of the winter snow, Edward stood once again beneath the arches of Buckingham Palace. A small package arrived for him, wrapped in Japanese paper, tied with a crimson cord. Inside was a single porcelain teacup, painted with delicate plum blossoms, and a note from Heroko, "For warmth on cold days from one who remembers." Edward placed the cup on his windowsill, where the morning light caught the blossoms, making them glow softly in the sunlight. And so, the story traveled from the gates of Buckingham to distant tea houses, from barracks to homes across the world. It was a reminder that even in the coldest of storms, compassion and humanity could find a way. We hope you enjoyed this incredible story of courage, compassion, and honor. What do you think about Edward's decision to break protocol and help Heroko during the snowstorm? Was it a courageous act, or should he have followed the rules? We'd love to hear your thoughts on this powerful moment in the video. Do you think kindness should always come before protocol? Or are there times when rules must be followed no matter what? Maybe you've experienced a similar moment of unexpected kindness in your own life, or perhaps you've witnessed a time when someone went above and beyond, just like Edward did. Share your story with us in the comments below. Your opinions and stories mean a lot to us, and we're excited to read every single one. So don't hesitate, leave a comment to join the conversation. And if you want to stay updated on more heartwarming stories and life-changing moments like this one, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you won't want to miss tomorrow's story. Thanks for being part of our community, and we can't wait to hear from you.